The life and sad ending of Daniel Johnston. Daniel Johnston was born Daniel Dale Johnston on January 22, 1961, in Sacramento, California, U.S. the youngest of 5 children of Bill Johnston, a former Second World War fighter pilot, and his wife, Mabel. Daniel described it as a Christian fundamentalist household. The family later moved to New Cumberland, West Virginia, where Daniel graduated from Oak Glen High School. After a brief, abortive stint at Abilene Christian University in Texas, he studied art at a branch of Kent State University near his family's home. During this period he began creating his homemade tapes in the family basement. Daniel Johnston's songs of love and pain made him one of the most unique figures of the American underground, and his outsider spirit set a template for indie rock on the whole. Though Johnston struggled with mental illness his entire life, his creative world was vivid, and his songwriting struck a moving balance between innocence and emotional devastation that would inspire everyone from Sonic Youth and Kurt Cobain to Yo.La Tengo and Wilco's Jeff Tweedy. If popular music is often driven by advances in technology, Daniel Johnston's work was proof that sincerity, simplicity, and primitive recording equipment can deliver enduring results. Became renowned for the haunting honesty and directness of his music. Its lo-fi quality emphasized the raw appeal of his voice, which was sometimes likened to the vintage recordings of Hank Williams or the bluesman Robert Johnson. Johnston himself cited the Beatles as his biggest influence. Rough, home-recorded, self-distributed cassettes in the 80s bloomed into more polished albums as Johnston's acclaim grew throughout the late 90s and 2000s. He accumulated a committed following on the alternative and underground rock circuit, and among his admirers and supporters were Kurt Cobain of Nirvana, Jason Pierce of Spiritualized, Jeff Tweedy of Wilco, Beck, members of the Butthole Surfers and Sonic Youth. Yet during the early years of his career, in the 1980s, Johnston's work appeared only on a string of crude homemade audio cassettes released on his own Stress Records label, which he used to give away. After he moved to Austin, Texas, in the early 80s, his tapes helped make him a local celebrity, though this did not bring any big-money record deals. He gained a significant profile boost in 1985 when he was filmed for a slot on the MTV show The Cutting Edge, which was focusing on Austin's New Sincerity music movement. This brought rapid national acclaim, and, as his tapes made their way from coast to coast, Johnston became an eminently droppable name on the underground circuit. The Dead Milkmen recorded his song Rocket Ship, and Yo.La Tengo and the Pastels were among several artists who recorded his speeding motorcycle. In the late 80s the Homestead label reissued some of Johnston's early recordings on vinyl, and his album It's Spooky was a collaboration with Jad Fair of the band Half Japanese. To be honest, his music was painfully honest, with narrative concerns focused mainly on lost love, the pain of miscommunication, his love for the Beatles, and comic book superhero Captain America. In 1981, while living in Austin, he compiled some recordings made when he was still in West Virginia as his debut album Songs of Pain, dubbing cassette copies himself and passing them out to friends and strangers around town. This would be Johnston's primary distribution method for his music for the next several years, as he prolifically released new tapes like Don't Be Scared and The What of Whom, Hi, How Are You? More Songs of Pain, and Yip, Jump Music, and Retired Boxer in 1984. He continued self-releasing cassettes throughout the 80s, and by the end of the decade, indie label Homestead reissued some of Johnston's early recordings on vinyl. In 1988 he visited New York to work with esteemed producer Kramer on a new album that would eventually be titled 1990, but the stress of working in a professional recording environment for the first time, in addition to neglecting to take his medication, resulted in disastrous sessions. With Johnston behaving erratically and unable to finish recording for the album, it was filled out with live tracks and previously released home recordings. Johnston suffered several psychotic episodes around the time his music career started to take off, one that led to a crash landing of a two-seat plane being piloted by his father. Miraculously, neither of them was seriously injured in the crash, but Johnston was committed to a mental institution for a time following the incident. In the early 90s, major labels started showing interest in signing Johnston. He turned down an offer from Elektra on the grounds that they released records by Metallica, a band he believed to be possessed by the devil, and opted instead to sign on with Atlantic. In 1994 he released Fun, his only album for the label, produced and accompanied by Paul Leary of the Butthole Surfers. Fun was one of Johnston's most self-assured albums up until that point, and throughout the late 90s and 2000s, he recorded some of the best music of his career. Smart, ebullient pop with ringing guitars, primitive keyboards, and a wonderfully naive way of looking at the world. Although he sometimes became sad and bitter, cynicism and self-pity weren't his styles, and that makes the little tragedies and epiphanies he wrote about all the more compelling. Johnston was exposed to an even larger audience in 2005 with the release of The Devil and Daniel Johnston, a feature-length documentary that premiered at the Sundance Film Festival, eventually making its way around the world. The Electric Ghosts, an album credited to the duo of Johnston and Don Jack Medicine Gaeta, arrived in March 2006, followed by As and Always Was in 2009. In 2010, Johnston worked with Beam, an 11-piece orchestra from the Netherlands, touring with them and eventually recording some tracks with them for his album Beam Me Up, which featured a mix of new solo work as well as some re-recorded classics. As the 2010s unfolded, Johnston pursued projects like his 2012 comic book Space Ducks, an infinite comic book of musical greatness, which was accompanied by an album and an iOS app. The following year, photographer Young Kim's book Daniel Johnston here appeared and featured 5 years' worth of photos of Johnston at home and on tour. The documentary Hi! How Are You Daniel Johnston? Was released in 2015, and 2 years later, he retired from touring with a farewell tour that saw him backed by Modern Baseball, Jeff Tweedy, and Built to Spill on various dates. Johnston died on September 11, 2019, at age 58. Thanks for what Daniel Johnston has left in this world. We remember him forever.